Hi everybody. So today we're going to get into our weekly lesson regarding aggression. Now keep in mind that as a part of this conversation about aggression, we're also going to be talking about some of the things that can happen as a result of aggression, which includes interpersonal aggression, violence towards other people. Oh, my cat has an opinion about that. And we're also going to talk about things like self-harm, which includes talk of suicide. So just as a heads up, we're going to be talking about some challenging topics this particular week. So just kind of be prepared and know that if you just want to look through the slides instead of listening to the narration, if that would be easier, then you certainly can do that. So let's first go over some definitions that we have associated with aggression. We can think of aggression as perceived intentional behavior aimed at causing psychological or physical pain. Now, the key thing here is that you must perceive it to be intentional. Regardless of the individual's actual intentions, perception is everything here. With hostile aggression, the goal is to inflict pain caused by feelings of anger. So here, the primary purpose of the action is one of aggression. Whereas with instrumental aggression, the goal is something entirely different, and basically inflicting pain happens as a consequence of the action, but isn't the primary goal of those actions. So emotion might not be the driving force behind this particular thing, and harm tends to be incidental, a means to a goal. So for example, if you're a football player and you tackle someone because you're trying to execute a play, then you might not intend to harm them. The goal is to execute the play. Whereas if you got really, really angry at a fellow player and tackled them because you were angry at them and wanted to hurt them, then that would be an act of hostile aggression. So a few other definitions include physical aggression, which is violent action toward another, and relational aggression, which involves interpersonal hostility, such as exclusion, gossip, and teasing. So aggression can take different forms, and different groups of people are more or less likely to engage in these forms of aggression. So for example, women are a great deal more likely to engage in relational aggression compared to physical aggression. As we know, rejection hurts, and so it actually uses the same pain pathways in the brain. So teasing someone and excluding them can be a form of hostility that can hurt people, sometimes very deeply. There are many different ways that aggression is researched, and this is a really great example of how important it is to have multiple methods when studying a particular phenomenon, especially when that phenomenon is hard to capture in a study. You can't create murder in a laboratory setting. It's not necessarily ethical. I think the closest that we've come is the Milgram study, and we could see how stressful that was for the participants of that study. So when we study aggression, we have many different methods that we use. So for example, we might engage in survey data to see how common people believe aggressive actions are and how acceptable they are, how much they align with their values, and how likely they would be to engage in aggressive behavior in certain scenarios. We can also study, to a certain extent, aggressive behavior in a laboratory setting within ethical guidelines. So for example, we might explore how people respond to certain threatening stimuli and then explore further how they might react behaviorally. So for example, in the jealousy study that I did, where I made people believe that their partner had been mildly flirtatious with a potential romantic rival, they had the opportunity to engage in aggressive behavior toward the partner and the rival by blasting each one with sound as part of a reaction time game. And I could measure how loudly they set the sound for as a potential indication of aggressive responses. You can also set a game that people play where they believe they're giving shocks to someone else, or a hot sauce. One of my friends actually did a study where he made people believe that the person who rejected them really hated hot sauce, and then saw how much hot sauce they would give them, and had to measure it out by weight to determine how aggressive people were feeling. So once again, in that particular case, you'd pay attention to things like the number of blasts and the intensity of the blasts or shock as a measure of different types of aggressive behavior. There's also archival data, so you can explore homicide rates and using police records, and you can track down basic other information that you can connect it with in order to explore patterns of aggressive behavior societally and when they tend to peak and why. So one of the reasons why it's important to have laboratory data is that archival and survey data have distinct limits, and one of those distinct limits is that you cannot establish causation with those particular methodologies. You're kind of exploring things after the fact in the case of archival data, or just simply asking people to self-report for survey data as opposed to manipulating variables and randomly assigning people to different conditions. So the best you can do is look for correlational patterns where you're seeing patterns in the data and ascribing them to different variables without necessarily determining cause. So these variables are related to one another, but one doesn't necessarily cause another. Another thing you can do is control for other possible causes. We'll talk about an example, taking a look at archival data with heavyweight championships a little bit later on, and that will go through some of the potential alternative causes that they controlled for in that study to support their hypothesis that it was the heavyweight championship that was the precipitating factor in spikes in homicides as opposed to something else. It's important to understand that archival data was collected by others who didn't necessarily have your research question in mind and weren't thinking that it might be used for a study later. So that data could be incomplete and they might not have asked the questions that you wanted them to have asked. However, once again, you can't measure murder in a lab. So sometimes we have to study lesser aggressive behavior in a laboratory setting and then study the more extreme versions of that behavior more anthropologically instead. So it's important to keep in mind that studying aggression can be challenging and that a variety of methods are needed in order to triangulate and to better understand what's going on in terms of our understanding of aggression. It's also important to note that archival data has a leg up when it comes to realism. Looking at real-world patterns and actual big picture data can be really valuable when it comes to understanding how people tend to behave. It's important to understand as we're diving into this that aggression can be an adaptive response to potential threat. So we can be using it to protect ourselves, to protect our resources, to protect our loved ones. And in fact, many acts of aggression are done out of the desire to protect other people or to represent a group that you feel needs protecting from some sort of threat. Aggression can also be instinctive, but it's not necessarily the best policy these days to reply to potential threat with aggression. In this society, punching someone in the face can get you a lawsuit or can get you a felony. So it's one of those things where people might have had very real needs to reply to threat with aggression, and doing so these days is not necessarily the best strategy, even though it might have been adaptive. So you can think of the understanding that we have about who is more aggressive and why as being individual differences in natural aggressive tendencies and the circumstances of the situation, whether the situation itself is threatening or non-threatening. So different people have different levels of aggression and aggressive tendencies within them, and this can be moderated by a threatening versus a non-threatening situation. It can also be impacted by the attributions that we make or the associations that we have in terms of the conclusions we come to, for example, whether someone intended to cause harm to us or not, or the reasons behind our own behaviors. Aggressive tendencies can also be moderated by the social rules that we have and the culture that we're surrounded by. So one of the readings I'm asking you to do this week is Nisbet, The Southern Culture of Honor. So you're going to explore his theory about how a particular subculture within the South tends to be more likely to respond with aggression when threatened. So for example, whether something is normal, whether it's rewarded or punished, whether it's considered to be valuable or reinforced within a particular society, can determine whether someone will be more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. You're going to see a couple of different examples of social rules throughout, both in terms of lectures and videos and the reading that we're doing. One video that I'm going to show you, for example, I'm going to mention later, is the Bandura Bobo doll experiment. So you can see how aggression can be learned and modeled from authority figures. And I also want to show you the other side of the coin. So I'm going to pass along an optional reading, let's go ahead and call it that, an optional reading where you're going to get to explore the Inuit culture and how Inuit parents specifically parent their children with a complete absence of anger. Expression of anger, frustration, and aggression is considered to be incredibly inappropriate in that particular society. It's a matter of life and death. People who live on the very edge of the natural world need every survival edge that they can get. And in the Inuit culture, they discovered that cooperation is key, and expressing frustration is something that does not work for their society's survival. So I've linked to a story that you can read about Inuit culture and how they basically are a society that functions without the public expression of anger or frustration. Now that doesn't mean they don't feel those things, it just means that it is completely culturally inappropriate to express them. And once again, that is their adaptive challenge.